This is a distance learning group. This Zoom is vacant, but there are usually students there
In a different
in Columbus.
So actually, your editor's sitting.
Yeah, right. In any minute, they're going to come in. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's wonderful to have Caitlyn Huey-Burns with us tonight, who writes for RealClearPolitics.com. And rather than read your bio, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Where you grew up, where you went to school, how you got into this line of work.
I grew up in Maryland, right outside of D.C., and I actually went to college not far from here at John Carroll University, just up the road in Cleveland. Majored in political science and English there. And then I moved back to D.C. after school and got a master's in journalism at Georgetown. And then I started, I've always been interested in politics, but didn't want to be in politics, and I was an editor at my campus newspaper and was interested in journalism, and so I started working at U.S. News and World Report soon after I graduated, and that then I started kind of getting into politics, covering politics a little bit there, and I started at Real Clear Politics in the summer of 2011, right before the last election cycle, a couple days actually before Rick Perry got in, so so that's how I remember that. And I covered the 2012 campaign, then I covered Capitol Hill for a few years after that, and now I'm back on the election beat covering the 2016 election. My colleague and I are focused mostly on the Republican candidates just because there are so many of them, but I also have been covering a little bit of the Democratic side, and then we have someone full-time covering the Democratic side. So there are a lot of people running, and we're trying to get our arms around all of them.
So do you live in Washington, D.C.?
I actually used to. I just recently moved to New York. That was for my husband's job, but I'm back in D.C. every couple of weeks and on the campaign trail actually more often than I'm home.
So tell us a little bit about RealClearPolitics.com and the rest of the Real Clear family of websites.
Well, we actually just celebrated our 15th anniversary, which is really exciting. Real Clear Politics actually started as kind of a basement operation. Our two founders were in marketing, and they were interested in politics and started to develop a website that aggregated news, kind of the one-stop shop, before Twitter and all of those other kinds of platforms that aggregate, one-stop shop for kind of all the headlines you need to know across the internet. And it just kind of developed into something much bigger. And now we have about a team of 5 original reporters covering politics specifically. We've branched out into a few verticals, which you're probably familiar with. Real Clear Policy, we have Real Clear Religion, which someone said that he reads, and Real Clear Education. We just launched Real Clear Health. And those are also kind of the same old aggregation sites, and I think those are going to start to develop into some original reporting. We also have a video team, which is pretty new as of this year, trying to create original video content. And of course we have the polls, which are kind of the pillar of our operation.
Yeah, I first found out about Real Clear Politics when I was probably very shortly after it was established, because I was interested in polls. And as you know, in part of the work that I do, talking with journalists, I like to look at a lot of polls, average them, and do all those kinds of things. And it was pretty interesting to find a website. Of course, now there are a lot of websites that do that, but I think if not the first, then very close to the first.
We're told it was the first, so I'm sticking with that. But it is, especially this year, we've seen as the polls have played a really big role in determining who gets on the debate stages. I think we've really become a go-to. We have been, but this cycle especially. We know the candidates tell me that they go on the site and look kind of where they are in the lineup.
Where does the term Real Clear come from?
Well, the two founders wanted a place that you could go and get and if you look at our site, it has not been updated in about 15 years, and it actually is getting a little bit of a facelift at the end of next month, we're told. So the idea is that it's kind of no fluff, no jazz, just kind of the straight, articles from the conservative side, articles from the more liberal side. We, as on our editorial side, take a very straight down the middle approach to our reporting, but the idea is that it's kind of cut through the clutter. Here's what you need to know. Here's the real clear perspective, which is really, actually pretty difficult these days with so much out there.
Well, tell us how that works. I mean, say we have an incident like, the tragic shooting out in Oregon,
Mm-hmm.
and then suddenly there's a lot of news reporting, there's also a lot of opinion reporting.
Yeah.
How do your editors select what to highlight on the website?
They always look for, from what I'm told, they always look for to represent multiple sides. I mean, there are not necessarily two sides to every story and every debate. These things are multidimensional. From our coverage standpoint, so they usually try to have, for the shooting, we had a column on our left-hand side that was titled, something like Oregon shooting, and then had, straight news, what was going on, then a couple of opinion pieces from the two sides. And then from a reporting perspective, we have a White House reporter who covers the administration, and she was covering kind of how President Obama was responding, and then we had coverage of how the presidential candidates were responding and that kind of thing. So we do try to cover everything when we can.
But there's always a choice, right? Because you can't list everything.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, some of your competitors, other news aggregating sites, have been criticized because they're too cluttered.
Mm-hmm.
They have too many.
Yeah.
And so it's very
Good
difficult
point.
to navigate.
That is a good point, and sometimes that is a challenge. There is so much out there. So many people are writing. The internet obviously allows for just so much room, and that, I think, compels a lot of people to publish. So I have confidence that they pick kind of what the best representation of the debate is.
So how did Real Clear Politics evolve from a news aggregator, basically linking and summarizing what other people were writing, to having people like yourself who write original journalism, original coverage?
Well, as you mentioned, a lot of news sites now are aggregating content, and they're also doing the polling average. So as part of this ever-changing industry, they needed to find a way to innovate a little bit and offer something more. So that's how they got into the idea of having original reporting, and I think they've been doing that for about 6 or 7 years now. So it is still relatively new, but we do have a full operating bureau in Washington, and we have editors and reporters. But it was a way to again stand out. And the approach that we take as reporters here, I mean, you have the wire services that offer you the minute-to-minute kind of coverage, and really everything you post nowadays is relevant for about a couple hours of that. So we try to take a little bit of a step back and try to do more analysis, which is why I talked to you, and offer kind of a next day kind of approach when we can, and it works for the most part.
I was going to ask you about the challenges of publishing on the web, as opposed to, we've had some other guests who were and are basically print journalists, but their organizations have had to do more and more web content. But their view is that there's something to be said for sort of finalizing a piece, and it goes into print and it goes into history, facts and all.
Yeah.
As opposed to one of our guests commented about how he'll think he's got it all finished, and then half an hour later, his editor will call him and say, well, you have to update the web version, right? Because something has happened. So,
Yeah.
so what are the special challenges of writing for the web?
You know, it's interesting. I think in journalism now, it's really web first. So you even see the New York Times really placing an emphasis on their digital product. And you see a lot of times the stories that are in the paper have already been printed or published online for, you know, at least a day sometimes. And so I think the challenge is that you do kind of have to be upfront about what you're changing in the story. And so you do see a lot of times a clarification or an update or a correction, or, you know, that I think is still really important. But because we're in this kind of 24-hour cycle, and news is kind of constantly changing, you know, that's a challenge. But it is, I mean, most online organizations operate the way that we used to do in you know, traditional print newspaper. You know, we have an edit team, we have, you know, story discussions, and we operate largely like a newsroom. And so, but it is, you know, the paper really I still read it, and I still subscribe, but you know, that's become really secondary to the online stuff.
This is probably a difficult question to answer, but, you know, one of the great worries that many people have had about the online world is the lack of editorial influence. Because things come up so fast, and all kinds of people can be out there.
Yeah.
That isn't to say that there weren't some really, really bad newspapers at one time, but, you know, having to have a printing press sort of set
Yeah.
a limit. Whereas now, you know, in the
Right.
stereotypical somebody in their underwear sitting in the basement can be,
Yeah.
you know, sending out all kinds of information. But do you think the editorial process for you all works the same way that it has traditionally worked at print?
I think we're trying to, and I think that we do. We have, you know, we have top editors, we have copy editors. The challenge though with online, with journalism in general, is this pressure to be first, to get the news out there, to get scoops, to be first. And so I think when that is the end goal, that does sacrifice, you know, the careful, you know, just being more careful about it, I think. So that's a challenge for sure for all of us. And especially now, I've noticed that Twitter is actually a big competition, I think, for a website like Real Clear Politics, because my instinct as a reporter is to tweet little bits of news, you know, as it's coming in, as it's vetted, of course. But you know, you do see something pop, and then the kind of story follows, or you'll say, I have this story coming, but here's the news. So it's certainly a challenge. There's just not as much time now, and there's a pressure to get it up.
I haven't figured out how to tweet yet. I'm going to have to learn. But I was talking to one of my former students who will remain nameless, and he was trying to explain to me about how to do it. And he got kind of exasperated, and he said, you know, the problem with you, Dr. Green, is you have never said anything in less than 144 characters. So that, you know, I think there's kind of a challenge.
You can annotate. You can develop the thread.
So how do you all, in terms of your team of journalists, how did you plan to cover? Maybe the plans are changing, but how did you plan to cover the 2016 presidential election?
Well, you know, at the outset, we actually didn't think these many candidates would get in the race. I mean, we wrote several stories about, you know, why so-and-so may not get in, and we then soon realized that everybody's doing it. So that was one challenge. I think what we try to do is we do try to get out on the road a good amount and actually go to these town halls in New Hampshire, go to these kind of, you know, barbecue places in South Carolina, or you know, wherever they're campaigning in the big state of Iowa. And you know, after the primaries, we do come to Ohio and Florida and all these you know, really big important states. So we do try to get kind of the on the ground perspective to really color what we're seeing in the polls, because As much as polls are helpful, they are also just a snapshot, and obviously, as you guys know, don't represent exactly what people are thinking and feeling. So I do think that's really an important thing that we try to do. And then, in general, we try to look for certain themes. So, right now I'm working on a story about Marco Rubio and how he's now kind of in the spotlight, and he doesn't necessarily want to be, how he's trying to play the long game and wait for everybody to fizzle out and he'll be left standing, but now he is rising in the polls and becoming a viable candidate, but that also means that he is going to be under the microscope, and you're going to hear a lot more about him. And we had a story the other day comparing, as Jeb Bush was talking about bringing his brother back onto the trail, we had a story about kind of the differences and similarities between the two in terms of policy. So we do try to look at the kind of the thematic elements, but also what people are doing on the ground. One of my favorite stories from a recent trip to New Hampshire was, on one side of town, Donald Trump was holding a big rally, and on the other side of town, Jeb Bush was holding a really small event, and just kind of the juxtaposition of the two events, and really, spoke to the kind of the two sides of this primary so far, was interesting. But a lot of it too is dictated by the news and the day by day. So as much as you can plan, you can, but a lot of times you can't.
What's your take on the Donald Trump phenomenon? Because I'll tell you,
Yeah.
Political scientists are baffled.
Well, we are too. Actually, the New York Times had an interesting magazine piece over the weekend, and the author of the piece kind of admitted that what we were all thinking was that, he's going to get in, but he's not going to. So we have, in the beginning, struggled with how to cover it. Is this going to be someone that's going to get traction? I actually, the day after he announced, I went to New Hampshire and went to one of his rallies, and the theme of my story was who supports Trump, because I think that was a big question, like who actually thinks that Trump should be president, and not in a demeaning way at all, but really trying to illustrate where the support is coming from. And that's when I learned that there was this real frustration that we knew about, but couldn't really see with the political system. So from there, I personally do think that he has the potential to fade. I think we've seen in his past couple events that I think that he needs some new material, is basically how I say it. As every candidate does, you need to update your stump speech. You need to, think about the longer term. However, everything that we've tried to apply to Trump's candidacy, every kind of lesson, every single bit from history, hasn't really applied. I always say the theory of political gravity does not apply to him, and so that's also really hard to game out. I do think, however, though, that we are seeing, we're seeing Ben Carson growing larger in Trump's rear view. I think that there is this real frustration with the political system, but that is also a little bit multidimensional. Do they want someone? We know that the base of the party is saying we don't want a politician. We're sick of the status quo. What kind of candidate do they really want? I'm not quite sure yet. We know it's not someone like Bush, but there's also potential for someone like Bush, I think. Or Rubio or Kasich or the establishment lane, I think, is still wide open, and we do talk a lot about the other side, but I think there's still some real competition there. So the short answer, or the short way of answering the question is, I really don't know how it ends, but I do think that it eventually does. However, it is hard to see, Trump being the front runner to going to someone like Bush. I mean, that is just a really far way to go. So I think there has to be something kind of in the middle.
We've been talking a little bit about the Democratic side. What's your take on the Republican side, what's your take on the Democratic side?
Well, I think another surprising element of this, and this is also part of what we're seeing on the Republican side, is the rise of Bernie Sanders. And we've seen him gain some real momentum. And I think that was illustrated best by his fundraising numbers this past quarter. And what was interesting to me about that is, his donor base is, the grassroots, the small dollar donations. He's not been doing a lot of fundraisers. So that does show there's a lot of passion behind his campaign. I also do, caution, you cannot underestimate how organized Hillary Clinton's campaign is, how much, how big their infrastructure is. As you know very well, the ground game, what we call, the organizing, getting people to the polls, getting people to turn out on a caucus night in Iowa is very difficult. The Clinton campaign has that in place. Sanders is working on it. Now he has money to do it, which is striking. But just like Jeb Bush, Hillary Clinton did not clear the field. And I think that is a challenge. The Democrats do argue, though, that, and I believe this to be true to a certain extent, that a primary is helpful to her, keeps her on her toes, keeps her engaged in the process, so that by the time, if she does become the nominee, she's not rusty and kind of faded. But I think that the campaign has not met its own expectations, I think, from the beginning. But that's a fascinating race. And I do think, to your point about the Benghazi, McCarthy's statements on Benghazi really handed her campaign a humongous benefit. She ran an ad on it today, nationwide. So if she can get a little bit of good luck, in that form, I think she can kind of correct course a little bit.
From your perspective, covering the campaign, how serious is the email scam?
When I talk to voters about this, they say, my impression is that they're not so much concerned of, the increments of it. I'm not sure that it's very, clear what the actual problem is, they say, but that there's an issue. So they do always ask about it. And it also, from, what we've reported, is that it really cuts into really adds to what we're seeing in the polls, which is the trust deficit and the, people respond in polls that they don't think her to be trustworthy. And so it just kind of feeds into a perception of her. And the problem is that everybody knows, for Clinton's campaign, but also a benefit, is that everybody knows who she is. So her name ID is sky high. She's not introducing herself to voters, but she is actually reintroducing herself to a lot of voters, particularly young voters who were around the last time she ran, or for her husband's campaign. So I think that has been a struggle for her. But I do think that there are ways to get around it. It's just with the way that the emails are released, in those batches, they're released every few weeks. So every time her campaign tries to change course or talk about a new topic, the emails come up again. So it's just kind of this perpetual lingering thing. And I think she's been criticized for not addressing it earlier.
Of course, everybody would like to know, is Joe Biden going to get in the race?
I would like to know too. I think every day we have something different. I don't know if you guys saw the interview he did with Colbert. I thought after that was kind of he was talking himself out of the race. What we know about Joe Biden, though, is that he's a long-time public servant. He's wanted the presidency for a long time. We know that. He's run for it twice before. I think that there's a part of him that, really wants to do it again. And, if you think about it, it's probably his last chance to really run. However, I'm not sure what his argument would be other than that. There's very little daylight between himself and Hillary Clinton. There's certainly no daylight between himself and he's part of the current administration. So I'm not sure how he could what his message would be. To the point you made earlier about him not participating in the debate, I think there is a sense that he is waiting to see how she does. And I think there's a little bit of sense among kind of the establishment side of the Democratic Party that, is perhaps glad that they have that option. But I do think it's fascinating that, up until now, there's really been no discussion about the sitting vice president running. I mean, that just kind of underscores the idea that Hillary Clinton is kind of running as an incumbent, so to speak, kind of with all the makings of that. So we'll see. I don't have an answer. I don't know.
I was talking to a bunch of friends of mine who are organizational Democrats, very active in Ohio politics, Democratic politics, and they all want Joe Biden to run. Half of them approximately want him to run because they really don't like Hillary Clinton for whatever. Some of it's personal, some of it's they don't think she can win. The other half are staunch Hillary supporters, but they really think that a Biden challenge would improve her campaign and that she would ultimately beat him. And with that in mind, Vice President Biden must really be thinking, if I get in, am I going to get in to win? Mm-hmm. Because he would know what it takes to do that.
Well, the other thing to remember too is that he didn't do well last time, and he doesn't have a campaign. This year or this cycle, everybody had like the pre-campaign. The PAC that was operating very much like a campaign, which is a whole other issue. But he doesn't have that. I mean, there's the Draft Biden movement and that they're organizing. But again, kind of going back to just what it actually takes to win, all the organization and infrastructure, he doesn't have. The other thing to consider too is that you've seen these polls, Biden, close to Hillary close to Hillary Clinton in the polls, or beating some of these Republican candidates. As soon as you get into the race, your numbers change. We saw that with Hillary Clinton, and she had very high numbers. We saw that with Jeb Bush as well. So I think that's something to consider too. But he's very likable. Democrats really like him, and I do think that the public in general likes him, thinks he's a good person, and he's been through a lot recently. He's a compelling person. I'm just not sure if he's going to do it.
The one thing that my Democratic friends, they could agree to disagree on the Joe Biden, but they got into a really fierce argument about whether somebody else would get in the race. And they all had their dream candidates. Like if Secretary Clinton doesn't do well, who would be the ideal candidate? It's really kind of interesting because no Americans have heard of these candidates, right? I mean, these are really insider candidates. But what do you think? Is it too late for another candidate to get in the Democratic race, other than maybe Biden?
I tend to believe that it is. The benefit Biden has is that he is the sitting vice president. He's done this before. He has very high name recognition. He's a known quantity. I think it would be very difficult for someone else to build that up, unless you're someone like Elizabeth Warren. I don't know, but she's is not going to do it. People have brought up to me the idea of Biden announcing with Elizabeth Warren and just going that, but conspiracy theories. I don't know.
Well, let me ask you about one more thing, and then we'll turn it to questions from the class. But what was your reaction to Speaker Boehner's resignation?
I was actually surprised at the timing of it. I was under the impression that he wasn't going to ultimately run for re-election, even though he was kind of saying that he was. I covered Congress during the whole shutdown era, the whole when the government shut down through, basically right after the 2012 elections through really 2014, it was all the attention was really on Congress and kind of what they were going to do. And every time, there were questions about whether he would lose the speakership, and there were challenges, but the opposition hadn't really coalesced around a real viable alternative. But you could also sense that, this was just not the circumstance in which he was brought up in Congress. I mean, he had been there, obviously, as you guys know, for a long time, and he's very much a institutionalist and appreciates the process. And you could just sense that he was exhausted by it. And it was. I mean, it was very difficult. I think what people underestimate about Boehner is that he saw himself as very representative of the conference and not necessarily the hardline leader of it. He never wanted to be seen as that. And I think people got frustrated with that part of his personality.
Do you think if there had been a motion to vacate the chair, as some had threatened, do you think he would have won this time?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, I tend to think yes, because because what we had seen in the past. I think if they hadn't been able to do it in those fights, I personally think he would have been okay. And we're seeing, up until McCarthy's stumble, there was, he does have support, and that's kind of a continuation of that administration. So.
I was as surprised as everybody, but my sense was that he was just tired of it. Mm-hmm. And, it's hard to blame him, given how fractious congressional politics have become.
Definitely. Very exhausting.
Well, let's turn to some questions from the class. Anyone? Yes, sir.
Okay, so looking at the GOP side versus the Democratic side, do you think that of the Democrats that are running, since they are all establishment candidates, if a non-establishment Republican nominee were to get the nomination, do you think that they could potentially pull the votes of people that are frustrated, even on the Democratic side, with establishment?
That's a really good question. I mean, I would consider Bernie Sanders a very anti-establishment candidate, even though he's been in the Senate for a long time.
I'm sorry, I meant politicians.
Anti-politician, yeah. That's a good question. I do sense that the kind of the anti-politician element on the Democratic side is a little bit different from the anti-politician element on the Republican side, because I think the interest in the insurgent kind of Sanders campaign, who I think of as the disruptor of the status quo, or campaigning as such, is based really on economics, and income inequality is actually obviously a really big the tenet of his campaign. I think on the Republican side it's it's just a little bit different. I don't think that they agree on that issue necessarily, although it is, we are seeing, support for Trump is, he is playing into that populist vein also. So there is, there's certainly that frustration. I don't know. You might have a better answer. I'm not sure that it would pull away. At the end of the day, I'm not sure that the Republican Party will nominate a non-politician, but this is the year that's proving everything wrong. So, but we've seen in history they like the non-politician or the non-conventional candidate, and then go back to the whatever we call it, establishment, whatever.
Well, one of the people in 2012 that passed in the Republican primaries as a non-politician was, of course, someone with a long involvement in politics. Was Newt Gingrich, but with many serious negatives. And one of the things we do in this class is every term we take a class trip. And in 2012, we went down to observe the South Carolina primary. and we saw the sudden rise of Newt Gingrich, and then, as you, I'm sure, remember at that point, Romney was reputed to have won Iowa. He didn't actually end up to win it later, but that was in the future, and he won New Hampshire, and then people thought if he won South Carolina, this was over, and the establishment was pretty happy. Not that Romney was their favorite guy, but they thought he was a pretty good candidate. And then we observed this kind of populist upsurge, and Gingrich did very well in South Carolina. In fact, it was kind of funny because we went to the election night parties in Columbia, South Carolina, and Romney had rented a big ballroom, and nobody was there. And but meanwhile, Gingrich had this little bitty ballroom. Of course, it was packed to the gills, right?
Yeah,
Because
and it was a real party too.
yeah,
So
it was,
remember.
it was pretty exciting. And then but of course he faded very quickly after that. So, there is, one could imagine some of these outsider candidates maybe even doing well initially, but then fading, perhaps because of the lack of experience with them.
That's interesting, right? And back to that point about actually turning out the vote. I do think what's interesting this cycle, though, and I think you and I have talked about this, but in Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina to some extent, because there are so many candidates running, I mean, you could win. You could win New Hampshire with like 20% of the support, and then you could also come in second with 19 or 18 and say, well, we're really within the margin of error kind of thing. I just think that they're winnowing the field is going to be more difficult this time. What I do think will be interesting to watch, though, are all those March primaries, all the Southern primaries. We're starting to see candidates campaign more there. But I am wondering if that, enthusiasm will continue through another year.
Our class trip this time is we're going to go up to New Hampshire at the end of October and hang out with candidates.
Oh,
and
wonderful.
watch them do their thing.
That's the best place to be. They're all. I was in Manchester recently, and you're walking down the street, and there's Kasich on one side, and then the next hour, another candidate is in. It's just there's always, you're about to run into someone up there with so many people running.
Another question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, you said that you're getting ready to do a piece on Rubio as he started to rise in the poll. Do you approach that kind of like a political science operative or a campaign operative would approach opposition research?
We as reporters, each campaign does have an opposition research team, and so they're all working behind the scenes to, you write one thing, and then someone from another campaign says, oh, well, here's some stuff on this guy, and so you do have to vet that out, though, which is really important. I think the biggest liability for Rubio, or two of them, in terms of policy, are obviously immigration. And also he is, there's a concern among Republicans that he is kind of reminiscent of Obama in terms of being a freshman senator with little legislative experience. Although in a year that experience is not a really rallying factor, I'm interested to see how that plays out.
Do you ever concern yourself with petty stuff, like in his past, his website, saying his parents were Cuban exiles from Castro, and then it turns out that, his parents came here years before Castro came back? Little things like that, or is it more policy oriented?
It's a little bit of both. When that bit came out, I think that was a really big story, just because he had talked about it so much. His family story, too, is so integral to his campaign, which I think is also a very compelling part of his campaign. So it is important to really consider everything. We focus mostly on the politics, what are his benefits, what are his liabilities, and try to fill it in with some kind of with obviously policy, but also what his critics are saying about him. So we try to balance it all. Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't really have like a first-hand
Yeah, that's really important. I do, we have really kind of built up just through covering the past few campaigns, you know, people that we know are reliable and can you know, you trust what they're saying. But it is really important to vet your sources. And especially, it's really important to, you know, when you're talking to someone, you know, what their background is, and make sure, you know, if they're telling you something, you know, or if they're working for another campaign, obviously that's important. If, you know, what their past involvement in politics has been. I haven't necessarily really had an issue with that, but it is, I mean, it's an important thing to know. Everything is searchable now, so it's easy to find out about someone.
Yeah, Alex.
So we hear often that politicians lead kind of a dual existence. They're elected officials and public servants, you know, for a certain portion of the day or for the week, and then they have to go hit the campaign trail on the weekend. So what's your experience like, having covered both campaigns and worked on the Hill, of seeing, you know, these individuals kind of in both existences? Is there continuity there? Is there, you know, a lot of line straddling?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And a really important point is, especially for House members, really as soon as they get elected, they are working the phones. I mean, it's not even kind of this job during the week and this job on the weekends. It's you know, in between meetings on the Hill, they'll go over to the, you know, their respective you know, campaign headquarters and make the calls, and they're always tapping donors. They're always, I mean, constituent service is obviously a big part of their job, but it is this constant need to, you're constantly running for re-election, and that affects votes, obviously. And especially now, in this, again, 24-hour cycle, every single vote is a campaign ad, you know, for better or for worse. So that's important. But it is a fine line. It's definitely more difficult for House members than for senators, just because they have more time. I mean, longer term. But the campaigns are such an industry now too, which is another kind of interesting facet of this. I think where the lines are really blurred are on the presidential side. You know, the super PACs and the campaigns. Like Carly Fiorina's campaign is mostly run by her super PAC, and so they're really testing the limits. But campaign finance laws really, the campaigns don't believe they have, you know, many teeth, you know, really to.
Was it more fun to cover the Congress or to cover the campaigns?
I liked covering Congress when I did, just because there was always some type of drama. Right now, well, actually, right now there was, actually, a couple weeks ago there was. The campaigns are just really interesting when you kind of get off the beaten path a little bit. You know, you hear the same speech over and over and over again, and you just tune out, but sometimes there'll be just something a little bit different. I think voters are just fascinating to me. You know, we see one thing in the polls, and sometimes they either, you know, support it, you know, back up what we're seeing in the polls, or sometimes I just really like seeing how people are absorbing campaigns. I think that's really fascinating, more so than the candidates. And just you can tell a lot about someone, how they interact with someone. I mean, we could see, you know, obviously Trump goes after Bush for being low energy, but you could see that in the beginning on the trail. He's very different from his brother in that way, not the kind of slapping you on the back kind of person. And that little, you know, those little things add up, I think.
Another question? Yeah, Doug.
You mentioned you live in New York now. I'm kind of curious if being outside of the district, I know you're covering campaigns, but just sort of, if it's changed your perspective at all, if it's sort of being removed from, you know, sort of the heart of, you know, the Capitol.
Yeah.
Has that changed you? Has it affected your job negatively or positively, because you're physically removed from a lot of where the decisions are made, but also your perspective? Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for covering campaigns, really nothing's going on in Washington. It's mostly outside, from a campaign's perspective, it's mostly the action is Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, and the other states are coming up as well. You can't cover Congress from New York. It's just not possible. The New York media. New York's interesting because the New York City politics are it's a whole different world, and I haven't really tapped into that yet. And also, obviously, financial news is huge. So, most of the people I talk to though are in these early states, so it doesn't make a huge difference as far as campaigns go. But it is a little bit refreshing, and this is why I envy a lot of you. A lot of times, it's not, it's refreshing to get out of that bubble, because it does become I don't know what the right word is. You're kind of talking amongst yourselves, kind of thing. Yeah, that's the right word. Yeah. So it's get some altitude and think a little bit.
Other question? Yeah, back in the back, yeah.
Back to the speaker. If this does become a race, I think the Democrats have a preference.
The Democrats have a preference?
Yeah, which way it goes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, they vote for her every time. I think they see McCarthy as someone they can work with compared to someone like Chaffetz, who's the other person that's running, a congressman from Utah. He's been running the oversight committee, and has been particularly hard on Democrats. So I think if they, I think they'd be okay with McCarthy as much as they could be. But it's always fun watching the vote on the floor because they always vote for Pelosi. So. Yeah, I think they'd be fine with that.
Joe.
You were talking about the level of frustration in voters. Out in Nebraska, they say that the Platte River is a mile wide and an inch deep. When push comes to shove, when the vote comes, is that frustration going to surface, or are they just going to sort of fall back into a sort of traditional establishment style of voting?
Well, I think that is one of the most interesting questions this cycle, because we have seen in the past that they do end up falling in line. McCain, Romney, were the past couple of nominees. I sense that this cycle is a little bit different. I'm just wondering, who that will be. So I do think you're seeing all of these candidates run against Washington, whether they're a part of it or not. I mean, Jeb Bush came out with something today saying that he is, a Washington disruptor, and while he hasn't served in Washington, he's very much considered part of its fabric just by virtue of his family. And so I do think that you're seeing a lot of these candidates really try to tap into that in some way. I think Rubio is trying to position himself as kind of the consensus candidate. Scott Walker tried to do this, but just wasn't agile enough, I don't think. Someone who is suitable for the establishment. I keep saying establishment, but you guys know what I mean. I mean, it's I know that's considered some people consider that not quite accurate, but the party, but also someone who is conservative. More conservative members think is fine. So I think that we're going to see someone kind of in the middle on that, between those two sides, just because, again, I think it's really hard to see Trump to Bush, but I think it's a great question, something we're following.
Another question? Yeah, Doug.
I'm kind of curious. You talked about so many different media outlets, so many different. Who do you read? Who do you trust? What information? Obviously, real politics, but seriously, I mean, where are you getting your news from that you believe is on the right path?
I do. I mean, every morning I check. I read. The New York Times has a running kind of blog called First Draft, and it's kind of just, as you guys have probably seen. I read that. I read. I think that some of these non-traditional outlets are doing some really good reporting. BuzzFeed, I know, is kind of considered you know, whatever it was before. But I do think that their political reporters are really, really good. They do a lot of good stuff. I have a couple of reporters that I follow at The Atlantic that I think do really good, thorough work, so I read that. National Journal too has some, which is also the same owner as The Atlantic, but they do a lot of good, really good political reporting. Politico to some extent. You know, I'm sure you guys all get that playbook newsletter. Trying to think what else. Those are pretty much my go-tos.
Do you watch television? I mean, television news?
Yeah, I have it on in the background. Yeah, I do. I'm not sure how helpful it is, but.
You know, I've always found, you know, and I've done television as well as other kinds of things, but the information content tends to be relatively low compared to print, you know, journalism.
Oh, sure. I every week I do a few TV hits for. I try to, you know, do MSNBC and Fox, and all, you know, try to keep a balance of appearances. But you know, I'm on for a minute, and it's, you know, distill everything you've just written into, you know, like 10
Right.
seconds. So that is challenging. But it is a good, you know, it is good to kind of tune into what the conversation is. I do think some of the shows do a good job at breaking things down. It is interesting. I mean, when I was in kind of studying this stuff, you know, the Sunday shows were kind of like the beacon of
Right. Yeah.
of coverage, and now, again, just with this 24-hour cycle, it's hard for them to stay at that level. So we're seeing, you know, like Chuck Todd has a show every day now,
Right.
trying to feed off of that. So it's constantly changing.
Another question? Yeah.
So I've got a soft spot in my heart, having interned with the campaign coordinating committee for the United States Senate. And part of my function in this class as the teaching assistant is I assemble news articles every week for the students to respond to. We have a blog, a discussion forum, it's really cool.
Oh, that's great.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Green's idea. But I try to, having my own biases, incorporate articles on United States Senate races. It's hard. There's not a lot out there. And
Yeah.
I understand a lot of people don't care if they're not races in every state. The presidency and the race for that takes a lot of people's attention. But do you think there's, I suppose, a place for journalists to kind of maybe steer
Yeah.
the rudder towards?
Yeah, I think Senate races are so fascinating. You're going to have a big one here, obviously, which will be really interesting. I think right now they're really in the recruitment stage in terms of getting candidates. Although Ohio's been, you know, has two pretty blockbuster candidates. And I think Senate races are in presidential years are obviously much different from midterm years. But and I think we've talked about this too, this idea of ticket splitting in presidential cycles. I think it's really interesting. At Real Clear, we do cover the Senate races, and we track all the polling in them. I covered the races in the past midterm. Roll Call covers they cover House and Senate most. You know, that's their main beat. So that's a really good resource, and they really get on the ground and really cover the ins and outs of these House and Senate races. National Journal does too, and we have one reporter dedicated just to that. Someone who covers the Hill now, but moves to the Senate races and that. But you know, the balance of power in Congress is just fascinating and interesting, and should be interesting to people, and how they are seeing the top of the ticket affect their races at home. I think we'll start to see more endorsements come from senators trying to, I know Senator Portman says he's not getting involved, but I'm sure he will want to make sure the top of the ticket is kind of in line with where he is. New Hampshire has a big Senate race. And Florida, too, obviously. Rubio leaving, so big
That's
races.
a great start
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
Well, speaking of Ohio, what's your take on John Kasich?
He's been slipping in the polls. He was, when he first got in, his super PAC was running ads in New Hampshire, and I think that really helped his poll numbers. I've followed him a lot on the campaign trail before he got in and after, and he is running, as you guys know, as the compassionate conservative, and he is campaigning. He's trying to, be if you're someone that is more inclined to someone like Bush, Kasich's campaign thinks you'll give Kasich a look if you're not wanting to vote for another Bush, or if you're not, if you want a more updated resume. I think that Kasich in the Republican field has, arguably on paper the best resume and experience. I mean, not, whether you agree with what he's done. I'm just basic kind of on paper. And he's very interesting to watch in town halls. I mean, he's been basically camped out in New Hampshire doing, several events a day. And he's just he's a different kind of candidate, I think. And I think we talk a lot about the idea that a politician or establishment is like the bad thing, but he's actually kind of embracing that, saying that, hey, wait, experience is a good thing, I've got it, kind of thing. So it'll be interesting to see how he does. I mean, I think he is starting to think beyond New Hampshire. I mean, he's starting to go into Iowa and campaign, and Democrats always say that, a Rubio Kasich ticket would be kind of powerful, so, and that would concern them. So I think he's a contender in some way.
Of course, here in Ohio, we think it would be a Kasich-Rubio ticket.
Right, and Kasich would think that too.
Right, somebody asked me once if, a national journalist asked me if I thought that Kasich would be vice president, because as far as he could tell, John Kasich had never wanted to be vice president of anything. And my response was, I knew what the guy was talking about. Governor Kasich is certainly a very self-assured man, but I think when the call comes, there's a tendency to say yes, because that's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Yeah, it's hard to make an argument against it
Right.
at that point. I do think he does have a very interesting presence in the race. And I do think that if Bush continues to slide, I think, Kasich gets another look. Voters I talk to in New Hampshire always say, I'm interested in him, I want to know more about him. Here in Ohio, everybody knows who he is. And, he's still kind of in the introductory phase in a lot of these early states. But we'll see. I mean, the debates have been really interesting. I mean, the first debate, he was obviously in his hometown, at his home base, so he had a lot of energy there. But I think he does have, the things that he is saying are really appealing to a certain group of Republicans, and something they kind of want to get back to.
What about the Senate race, Portman, Strickland?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, that's the other, Kasich's obviously, his rationale is his general electability, having won Ohio twice. I don't know. I think, well, you and I had talked a little bit about the idea of, or the possibility of splitting the ticket, of voters splitting the ticket. It's hard to see Portman losing, but again, in a presidential year, I'm not sure I'm just not, I'm not sure. And the past couple of times Democrats have won Ohio, so, I'm not sure. That's still picking up.
I have to be careful when I talk about that race because I'm fond of both Governor Strickland and Senator Portman personally. But I do wonder a little bit about if Strickland has the energy for another statewide campaign. Because as you know, Ohio is an extremely difficult state to campaign in because of all of its diverse regions, and it really takes a lot of effort. Then many of us remember when he ran for governor, and he was very energetic and very effective, and both the time he won and the time when he lost. But he's older now, and you just wonder if he has. I mean, nothing. That's not a political criticism, but I just wonder if there's the personal resources to do that.
That's interesting. And has he been involved much publicly, since leaving or since losing?
No, he
Yeah.
really hasn't. He's
I saw him once on the campaign trail when Obama was running for re-election. But I'm not sure if you guys have seen more of him.
I haven't seen much of him in the state, really.
Yeah.
It's been another question? Yes, sir.
Who do you think would be like the next big name to run out of the Republican side? If you had to predict somebody.
I've been thinking it's Rand Paul. I wrote about this recently. He's also campaigning for a Senate seat and raising money for it. He as you know, entered the race as the had a real clear niche, as the libertarian candidate. But his votes have reflected, have really kind of angered some of the real, libertarian voters that had been behind his father. Ted Cruz came out last week with, a list of endorsements from former Ron Paul people. And the excitement is not the same for him as it was for his dad. And his past couple of debate performances have not been necessarily compelling to that group and to kind of the broader Republican Party. The other thing is that while he can stand out, the Republican Party has certainly, kind of re-embraced its more hawkish roots on foreign policy, and so it's really hard to see him getting through a Republican primary on that regard. Even some of the more, center-right candidates have really embraced that more conservative stance on foreign policy. So I think it's hard to justify. I also think, having watched him on the campaign trail, he is not, he doesn't always appear as enthused by it. So, I think his critics would say that he needs to pick it up a little bit. He had an interesting bit today. He's asking his supporters to help him design the next campaign ad, so that's a sign that he's trying to get people involved in his campaign. But he's been sinking in the polls, and it's hard to see him keep going.
Yeah.
Have you heard anything about Rand Paul getting pressure from Republican Party leaders at home to get out of the race and start campaigning for a Senate seat?
Well, I'm not sure that Kentucky has a really interesting governor's race right now, so a lot of the focus has been on that. The other interesting thing about Rand Paul is, he supported Mitch McConnell during his re-election bid last time as a way to kind of get that support back, and that also kind of cuts into his anti-Washington message. But I think, on the Senate race side, he has a little more time. I mean, he's still campaigning for it. He just had a couple fundraisers for it, so they don't seem too concerned about that race at this point, also because it is going to be in a presidential year, and they're pretty convinced that Republicans will, continue to win the state. But I think, if he pushed to have the rules changed so that he could run, it's kind of like an insurance policy to his presidential bid. So it's hard to raise money for the presidential bid that way when people know that you've got a backup plan. Like Rubio is not running for a Senate seat.
Another question? Well, what's next for Real Clear Politics?
We've been going to all the debates. We'll have someone, we've kind of been trading off. So we have someone going to Nevada next week to cover the Democratic debate. We are redesigning our website, so we're getting a little bit of a facelift at the end of the month. I think I said that before, but in case I hadn't, check it out. I figure saying it's going to be in the next few weeks, and then until I'm going to Iowa at the end of the month for a Republican summit to cover some of the candidates up there. We are going to the early states, covering all these people, and kind of seeing how the campaign plays out. And we're still hoping that people come to us for their polling, check in on where they're polling.
You mentioned video content.
Mm-hmm.
Who thought up changing lanes? First of
Oh.
all, you need to explain, and people who might not know what changing lanes is.
So the interesting thing about news now, which you guys know, is that people are accessing it in a variety of different ways. I mean, I know a lot of people have canceled their cable, and you see video on the internet now and on your phone. So Real Clear has been trying to kind of tap into that with original video. One of our original products is this segment called Changing Lanes, where we have one of our editors in a car with a newsmaker of some sort. I've done it once. It is a little dizzying in the car. So they've kind of, but the idea is that you're kind of just driving around. Have you guys seen that Jerry Seinfeld thing? It's kind of trying to play off that. Yeah, except there's no reward at the end. So I think what we're trying to do is really just think of different ways to present content. What do you think of it?
I like it a lot, and
Okay.
and I'm not a
We'll
journalist.
have to get you in the car.
Oh, well, I'll probably
Next
get
time
dizzy
we're in
too.
Ohio.
But the, it's one of those things, I actually feel a tiny bit of envy because I wish I'd thought it up. Because it's very casual, they're driving around, and I think most of the time the guest is in the front seat and the editor's driving. And I remember the very first time I saw it, watched it, and they were clearly driving around Washington, D.C. And I kept waiting for the driver to run into something.
Yeah.
Be-
That's why I never drive.
Because they're having this
I was
animated
thinking about that.
conversation and they're going around circles and it's Washington, D.C. Ah!
Yeah, I know, that's always my concern, which would make for great video, but.
But I think but it's very relaxed, and you get some very impressive people and they're very informal.
I think the informal nature is really the key. I think, people just want to see a little, they want to see people kind of outside their comfort zone a little bit, but in an environment that's accessible. And kind of, I always want to be a fly on the wall in certain conversations, and so I think the idea is to kind of, people driving around talking about politics.
So how often is there a backseat editor on Changing Lanes?
Oh, I think that's just, in terms of scheduling.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because there's some of the things where the editor's driving and talking to the guest, and then there's somebody in the back
In the
seat
back, yeah.
who's also participating.
I don't know if you saw the one with Dana Perino.
Oh, yes, I did.
And she brought her dog, and so they sat in the back. So that was interesting.
Yeah, that was. But what other kinds of video content are you all thinking about, or is it pretty much Changing Lanes?
We're doing we have a Capitol Hill reporter in Washington who does kind of a weekly, 3-minute, here's what happened on the Hill this week. We also have another reporter in Washington who does a, this week on the trail kind of video, which is great. I think it's called Keeping It Real Clear. So they're trying to do these little, 2-minute kinds of videos, and the idea is that people are watching TV on their computer or on their phone, and not watching TV, but they can access it through that way. We also occasionally do, when immigration was becoming a really big issue on the campaign, we did kind of, here's what's kind of a little PowerPoint-y kind of thing with some dynamic video of kind of here's the issue. And I think we're trying to do more of that. What we'd also like to do is offer kind of tidbits from the trail, kind of, video from a town hall or video from, some kind of event, or, so we're kind of playing around with different options. I think it's a new territory for us, but I think they're doing a good job.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
If you could pick your ticket right now for the Republican side and the Democratic side, who would you pick? If you could choose a presidential side.
Oh, I'm not a betting woman, but I personally, I don't have I try to stay neutral so that I can cover everybody effectively. And I think there is, I do think that Clinton ends up getting the nomination. I really do think so. Her vice presidential pick will be very interesting. I don't think it's going to be any of the candidates who are involved now. She's been talking a lot to in Texas.
Julian Castro.
Yeah, Julian Castro. I always get the brothers confused. Which one's in Congress? Joaquin's in Congress.
Yeah.
Okay.
Joaquin, yes,
Okay.
he's talking to Joaquin or talking to who?
Um, the
Joaquin did an event with us today.
Cool.
he's now in the administration, but Julian is. That will be a little bit of a harder question. I think on the Republican side, the ticket will include people who are in the race, because all of them are in the race. So, I think there are two primaries in the Republican primary right now. One is for the establishment lane, and one is for the kind of insurgent kind of candidate. I wouldn't be surprised if the field winnowed down to someone like Rubio and Cruz. I don't anticipate them ever sharing a ticket, but if that's, I kind of can see that scenario playing out. I obviously think, Republicans could make a compelling case for Kasich being on the ticket in some way, whether at the top or the number two. But I don't know. I think, I do think Rubio is very interesting to watch. I'll say that.
Well, we have a whole group of people here who observe at least Ohio politics, if not national politics, on some regularity. Is there any question you'd like to ask us?
Yeah.
Not necessarily me, but folks out there.
Yeah, that's great. What do you guys think of Kasich? Are you glad he's running? I mean, Ohio is always on the map, but I think that people are coming here early. And you guys have the convention, so that's obvious.
Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
Purely from an entertainment standpoint, to have the city governor running is fascinating to me. I really, I wish Democrats would have run something better against him to really test him in 2014.
Yeah, that's a good point.
He talks about winning Cuyahoga County a lot, and you go, well,
There
you're
wasn't
running-
competition.
Yeah, you're running against nobody at that point.
Yeah.
And so I wish that would have been, I think that would have made it a little more interesting if he had an actual challenger in 14. Also, if you need a place, my wife and I are willing to rent out our house to Real Clear Politics staff.
All right.
I live close to John Carroll, so you can get up.
All right. A twofer.
What's your rate?
Well,
Yeah, that's the question. I was
Oh,
gonna
wait.
say, you guys could all run pretty lucrative businesses around.
Yeah, back there.
I think that John Kasich is probably the most astute politician in the Republican field. I think that from what I've seen and known his career, whenever he first ran in 2000 to now, the way he is as a politician and a campaigner is just like, he's grown so much over that decade. Decade and a half. It's pretty amazing to me how good of a politician.
That's really interesting. Are there any, sorry.
No, I was going to say, did you have some to?
I was just gonna say, I like how he appeals to both sides of the party. I think his comment during I think it was the first debate about going to he's like, I've been to a gay wedding. I thought that kind of played into, he's not necessarily
Yeah, he's definitely taken that approach, and I think that's really interesting. Are there any local issues that you think will play into, I mean, certainly House and Senate races, but any local issues, or I guess it's too early for 2016 ballot measures, right? But anything that could play into the race?
We're making a big push on redistricting reform
Okay.
right now, so that'll be on the ballot in 2015, and that's just state legislative districts.
Okay.
But in theory,
Mm-hmm.
we get more competitive state legislative districts perhaps. These become more competitive elections, this drives turnout,
Okay.
maybe comes to influence the federal congressional map, maybe not, maybe just influences turnout, but certainly could be a factor.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Keep an eye on that.
Other issues that come to mind? Yeah.
I mean, I think both state issues are gonna play a huge impact on voter turnout, not necessarily in this race, but in the primary. I think that if,
Yeah.
we see, issue two going either way, I think that's gonna draw a different crowd into the primary and even the general.
Okay. Oh, so that's in the primary. Those two issues are.
No, they're on
They're
the,
the 15 judges.
Oh, they're in
I'm
the
just
15.
thinking
Okay.
that they would
Oh.
then pull in a
Yeah.
different.
Yeah, let's
Oh,
say
okay.
issue 3 doesn't pass.
Then they can
and
return
then-
to-
Right.
Oh,
so then
gotcha.
It looks
Okay.
a lot like that comes back in 16, and then you're talking maybe a 1-2% increase in turnout.
Oh,
for-
interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, I always like to keep an eye out for those kinds of things because in really close races, I mean, that 1%, 2% can make a big difference.
I think the most important issue in Ohio for next year, not this year, is sustained job growth. Ohio for a long time has lagged behind the nation in terms of unemployment and job growth. Right now, it has a lower unemployment rate than the national level, and there's been some real gains in employment, particularly in manufacturing. Partly that's because the decline of traditional manufacturing is over, because there isn't any traditional manufacturing left, right? It's basically become high tech. But if you talk to Ohio voters for very long, the ups and downs of the economy, which is a traditional issue in Ohio, but it really troubles them, and they would really like to hear, whether it's from the Democratic side or the Republican side, how do you have sustained economic growth, sustained job growth? And right now, a lot of Ohioans are prepared to believe that's possible.
Okay.
25 years ago, many Ohioans believed that wasn't possible because of the
That's
declines.
interesting.
So it's just interesting. I
So
think
they've seen reasons to be optimistic.
and so they want to hear from candidates. We have these better conditions, and what can you do to sustain job growth? Which is it's just interesting to me because in a lot of ways that's the issue under the surface. We hear about entitlement reform, we hear about health care, we hear about government spending, whatever. There's a lot, but beneath the surface is well, how's this going to contribute or hinder sustained job growth? So, anyway, that's my 2 cents.
I tend to agree with that because I think, as we know, when it comes down to voting, people vote on the economy, but also the important fact, component of that is how they personally feel about their personal situation, so.
And there's I wouldn't say that Ohio's optimistic, except by comparison to the
Okay,
past.
yeah.
Whereas, by comparison, is very
Very,
optimistic. Particularly in this part of the state, the northeastern Ohio, because there have been such difficult economic times for so long.
Right. Okay. Is Ohio still a swing state?
Yep. In presidential
The
elections.
president, yes, yeah.
Yeah, we're very, very competitive in state level elections, but it's not the swing state. That in state elections, Democrats win, Republicans win, but historically Ohio leans more Republican in state elections. But we have, like in 2006 with Ted Strickland, a real blowout on the Democratic side. 2010 kind of the other way on the Republican side. But in presidential elections, it's still the only state that may be more so is Florida, because you can get a pretty good debate going as to which one's more of a swing state, and they're both big states. So.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Well, do we have one more question? Yeah.
When you're looking into doing polling in different states, how much do you look at like bellwether counties as compared to
Oh, we don't do the actual polling, we just aggregate it. Do you mean in terms of, we aggregate, polls that are already done?
Yeah.
From a reporting standpoint, reporting on polls is often really hard because they're not all the same, which is also sometimes the struggle with aggregating them. And we do try to kind of weed out, we do try to have a group that is, the same, similar in, voter ID and the representative of the sample. So, but we do, when we go on reporting trips, for example, like last time I spent a lot of time in, Cuyahoga County area. So we know kind of where the pockets are, and Columbus too. I mean, as you guys know, obviously, Columbus and Cleveland are the most visited, right? I mean, areas for presidential candidates. For the same amount, or Democrats more?
Both parties, Democrats come a little bit more to Cleveland.
Okay.
Although a lot of Republicans come to the Cleveland area because there's a lot of, even though it's on balance a Democratic region, there's lots of Republican votes here. But it's very even in Columbus.
Okay.
Between the states. I think the biggest media market in Ohio is actually Toledo, because your spots are also in Michigan, as well
that
as
makes
Ohio.
sense.
So,
Makes
but
a lot of sense.
but the three C's, Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati, are very big media markets. Well, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you guys for having me.
Please join me in thanking you.
Thank you.